Hello, I am Kevin Rogers. I'm the Director of Reasonable Faith Adelaide, and tonight we're going to have Trevor Harris talk to us on the geographic reliability of the Bible. And he's going to take us through, cover sections from Genesis, Exodus, Joshua, the four Gospels, Acts, and Revelation. So he's just going to grab some glimpses from bits and pieces right across the whole spectrum of the Bible. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Trevor, and I'll just start the sharing so he's able to talk to his slides. So Trevor, thank you very much. It's over to you.
Thank you, Kevin, and for the opportunity to share. So this is an overview on the topic, and if we go to the next slide.
Right, I am awake.
Without geography, you are nowhere, according to Jimmy Buffett, a songwriter. I thought that was a good intro to the topic on the importance of geography. The Oxford Dictionary gives the definition as the scientific study of the Earth's surface, physical features, divisions, products, and population. But from a biblical point of view, this involves the God-created topography of the earth and the human-created features. When the Apostle Paul had the opportunity to give an address to the leading scholars of his day at Athens, we're told in the book of Acts, he made a very profound statement and a controversial one. In Acts, it says that God who made, he said, this is Paul speaking, the God who made the world and everything in it, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him. So one of the issues that comes up very quickly in the discussion about Bible geography is the question, does the Bible support a globe? And some criticize the church that it supported the old idea of it being a disc and that you could fall off it if you sailed too far into the sunset. But when you look at the overall picture of some of the references, it is implied that it is definitely a globe that was created and definitely a globe that's in the biblical viewpoint. For example, in Genesis, we get very detailed information about recording of the months, which are lunar, and also the hint of years, which must have been determined by a certain number of months to indicate that they had a high understanding of astronomy. And I believe Adam, very early on, because of his relationship with God, actually had a lot of insight into what God had created, and therefore the globe is there from the beginning in the biblical understanding. We have, of course, that passage in the book of Job where he says, he, God that is, stretches out the north over the void and hangs the earth on nothing, which is an accurate description of how our world is, that it is suspended in space. It does move, but it does hang on nothing. And then in Isaiah, it talks about the circle of the earth, which is where a lot of the debate is, and we'll see in a minute the quotation on that. But the other thing I'd throw into you for a comment is the comment made in the book of Acts about the preaching of the gospel, where it says it will be preached in Jerusalem as the starting point. It'll go to Judea, the region nearby, then to Samaria, which is adjacent region, and to the uttermost parts of the earth. It uses that terminology. So the question is, where is the uttermost parts of the earth if Jerusalem is your reference point? Well, if you do your calculations, and you'll see the little diagram I've got on the side there, you arrive in the South Pacific in the French Polynesian area, and there's a little island called Rapa. I've misspelled it there, not Rapu, it's Rapa, or Rapa Iti it's called. It's a little volcanic island in the South Pacific, which is the closest landform to the uttermost parts of the earth. So what's interesting about French Polynesia is they were evangelized by Catholics in their early period of contact, and then later on English missionaries arrived and made a big impact on the French Polynesia. It's so strong there that every year they actually celebrate Missionary Day. On the 5th of March, they make a big thing of the fact they received the gospel. So the fulfillment of that statement that it will be preached to the uttermost parts of the earth is literally fulfilled in the Tahiti Islands. Little anecdote on the topic. So there's an interesting quote by a scientist and engineer, quite educated guy. He says, while most modern Bible versions translate Kug as circle, a good case can be made that a sphere was the sense intended by the original Hebrew. The sense of roundness and common usage makes clear that this can refer to either a 2- or 3-dimensional geometry. So it's interesting that some of the medieval Bibles using Latin translated the Kug not as a circle, but used the Latin word globus. They understood it as implying a sphere. So there is a case that the circle of the earth is actually reinforcing the global idea. So there is this reference in Genesis that says on the days of creation that on the 3rd day, God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And he saw that it was good. So that original construction by God is fully good, fully functional, earth and water, creating our globe. And over time, explorers traveled a lot of it, but it wasn't until 1570, a chap called Abraham Ortelius was the first geographer to make a world atlas. And as a result of his study and research, he came up with the idea of continental drift. His argument, which is shown in a later guy's map of the world, if you can see it there on the left, is that originally the world's landmass was concentrated, and the Americas and Africa and Asia and Europe and dear old Australia, tucked in the bottom there, were all connected at some point. Now, in the science world today, they have terminology for that, Pangaea, the one world idea. So there is this debate about what was this landform that God originally created. And following on from Abraham's work, there were other scholars, and one of note in 1858 was Antonio Snyder Pellegrini. He was a geographer, and he had this idea that you could map some of the drift and explain everything from a geographical viewpoint with continental drift. Now, his idea got taken up in the next slide by another scholar called Wegener. And in 1929, he developed the theory more and did a lot more research and said you can build the argument that there was once a big landmass. And he got laughed at by scholars, and the part of the laughing at was due to the fact they couldn't get a mechanism to explain what pulls everything apart. There has to be some force that does that. But nonetheless, in more recent decades, scientists have argued there is other explanations for the movement, but it resulted more in plate tectonics as an explanation, not so much pulling apart, but there's actually fractured plates all around the planet that move in reference to one another and explain a lot of the features on the landscape at their junction. So that's a bit of background on this thing. Now, just to create a bit of controversy, I throw in this question. If God created the first world good, and it's functionally good, where do we get the concept in the biblical worldview of hell and the fall of Satan? So my question is, if Satan and his angels are a reality and they're on the earth, did their arrival on earth puncture the earth and shatter? This is my question I'm raising, shattering the earth in a way that it was no longer totally good, but it had another dimension within it which was not good, and that's the domain of hell, which many scholars argue does exist in some way, even though it's hard for us to measure it with our technology. It's still a real dimension, and Jesus taught that it's a real dimension. And we have death entering into the creation. So that first world starts to have a curse at work in the environment, the death of plants and animals, fossils, all that comes in what's called the pre-flood world. So that's the first catastrophe concept I want to mention. The second is the Bible teaches clearly Noah's flood was a real event with real ark being built to save the family of Noah. But that had extensive water coming from above and below, giving enough water to flood the earth, and every mountain in that pre-flood world got covered. And it even gives a dimension of 15 cubits, which is about a 7 meter. So what we're saying is the Himalayas, the Andes, were not in that first world. So we're not covering the Himalayas with 8 meters of water. We're covering much lower landforms. And after that flood, we're told a new world arrives, but the tectonic movement of the plates is what creates the Andes and the Himalayas, and they're still in movement. The Himalayas are still slowly moving upwards even today. And there is drift happening in some of the continental plates. And then with the whole environment factor, the Ice Age emerges after that event with major changes to the Earth's structure. And the Ice Age has a big effect on the world's geography for the first 400 years, some say, after Noah. The next question of debate is the Garden of Eden. Genesis describes it as a real place with real people, real consequences. So my background is urban and regional planning, so I've always had a fascination with maps and mapping logic. So I asked the question, is there any logic to support the Garden of Eden? And there's quite a few proposals when you go into the topic made by scholars. And the next slide will show what the United Nations has to say on the matter. But my proposal is that somewhere over the area of Iran today could have been what's called the region of Eden, but within that region, a specific God-created garden was made with special properties, and that's where Adam and Eve were. Adam placed originally, and then Eve created from him. And then out of that garden, these 4 rivers flowed. Now, what's interesting is Moses is describing here very specific geographic locators, giving support for a location where I'm showing it. The first river, Pishon, goes through the land of Havilah. And Havilah, if you look up all the Bible references, is always in the context of what is Saudi Arabia today, either on the eastern or western side of it. That's where the Havilah references are. So there's an argument of a direction to the southeast. The next river, the Gihon, specifically names the land of Cush, is where it twines around. Cush, there's no argument. It's down in Sudan, and today Cushites still used to describe people from that part of the world today. So that gives a direction in the southwest direction. The third river, the Tigris, again, is described as flowing east of Assyria. No argument where Assyria is, well documented in Greek, Assyrian, Hebrew sources. That's heading in a northeasterly direction, which means the Euphrates of that world probably ran in the direction of Europe in some way. So what I'm putting forward here is a very geographic argument for a locality that today we can look at. And down the bottom, there are all the scriptures that I just explained to you about the 4 rivers. So Kevin, we'll just look at the next slide and you'll see where my logic's going. If you look up Garden of Eden and type in UNESCO, they recognize significant sites all around the world, which they say have historic or cultural or geographical significance. And they place and name the Garden of Eden in the area today of southern Iraq at the end of the Tigris River, marshlands, and that is their designated spot. And they honor that as saying there is something in the tradition of the Garden of Eden found in the 3 major religions of the world. And that location's not that far from which is made famous in the Bible, where Abraham starts his journey. So I'm interested in identifying an area that might have what I call some prophetic connection. And we're told in a Genesis account that the Garden of Eden is east of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, we'll see, is a reference point for biblical direction. So we come east of Jerusalem a certain distance. I'm interested in plotting Noah's altar, and I have done a paper on this to Reasonable Faith. It's on the web there of where the ark landed and where there was a covenant made between God and Noah's family. So a special altar up there. And what I'm saying is all those 3 altar sites have connection, because in the Garden of Eden, God comes, and I believe it's actually Christ coming in angelic form. When the fall occurred, he had to sacrifice a ram there to create the skins to put on Adam and Eve, because the fig leaf garments they made was not acceptable covering. It had to be by a sacrifice that they got covered. So we see a very powerful prophetic pointer here. So what I'm saying is the sacrifice in Jerusalem, the sacrifice of Noah, and the sacrifice in the Garden of Eden can be seen as signposts to the great plan of salvation. And the Apostle Peter picks up on this point when he says that in one of his letters, the precious blood of Christ was foreknown before the foundation of the world. Now, what that's saying is before God even put the world together, it was intended that Christ would come and be the Redeemer in it. So what I'm saying is everything has to have a logic related to the plan from the beginning to the end. And that's what I'm trying to illustrate here. So Jerusalem is, according to the Bible, a omphalos in Greek, which means navel. It's the spiritual center of the world from God's perspective. And it says in Ezekiel, "This is Jerusalem. I have set her in the center of the nations, with countries all around her." And if you go to Jerusalem today, in the outskirts, just out from the old city, on a massive wall, there's a whole lot of ceramic tiles illustrating a very famous medieval map, where the medieval church wanted to illustrate what we just read. And you see there the three clover leaves are representing the three continents: Asia on the top right, Europe top left, and Africa to the south. And right in the center is the city of the great king, Jerusalem. So it's no surprise God's great work of salvation has many things happening there. So here we have it, thanks to Google Earth, the biblical view. So whenever the Bible geographically describes enemies coming from the north or people coming from the east, wise men from the east, the Queen of Sheba from the south, all of that is understood when you put Jerusalem in the center there, and at 45 degrees from it, you get these quadrants, which make sense from a geographical viewpoint. Now, we have a navel too. Ours is not in our stomach. Our navel is in Greenwich in England, where all our time and clocks are set by the Greenwich Observatory. That's our navel for all time that we measure. The French wanted it in Paris, but the English won out, and it's now the standard for the world. So Genesis, continuing on, has Noah's family migrating from the east and heading in a westward direction. Bit of debate on that, but I do support that understanding. And it says they found a plain in the land of Shinar. There's no argument on Shinar being the land of Mesopotamia, the land today between the Tigris and the Euphrates. So somewhere in there, Noah's family set up camp. And in my last talk on the topic of the post-flood world, I propose an archaeological site near Urfa, and we see it on there on the left. The final campsite is where there's evidence of a major site of worship involving concentric rings of very developed stone pillars, and it's dated very old, and it's seen to be one of the oldest worship sites in the world, according to the German archaeologists working there. So my proposal is that's a good candidate to consider for the starting point of the human family post-flood. And we're given details of the family in that the fathers are named, specifically Shem, who I think is the one on the left there, Ham, he's the father of the Semitic nations. Ham is the father of the African nations, he's in the middle, and Joseph is the father of the Indo-European nations. Now, what's interesting is the names actually pop up in different cultural groups, and they're actually deified in some cultures. For example, Joseph is acknowledged by sources, not just biblical, but other historians, as a name in Greek legend as Japatos, and he's revered in that tradition. So there is a book out, which by a historian. He talks about the world after the flood and goes into all the historical references showing that many of the people groups of the world with their geography and names actually can trace their lineage back to this family of Noah. And many years ago, I was quite shocked attending an Anglican church When one of the parishioners told me, he says, did you know in England there's a church that has tablets that shows the Queen of England can be related back to Adam via Noah? And I go, what? But that was the claim. But anyway, in this book, it goes into it. There's lots of names that show the commonality that's there, showing as humans, we're not the product of grunting savages or apes getting smarter. We're actually descendants of a very intelligent family that had a lot of technology, intelligence, and probably the ability to read and write from the start. So going into a bit of detail now, we've got here 3 charts. Now, Shem's descendants are all named, and from them, people groups can be assigned to them, which historians, not just Christians, can agree on. For example, Elam is the father of the Elamites, and they're well documented in Iran. They become the Persians. Asher becomes the Assyrians. They're in Iraq. Asfaxad is the father leading to the Hebrews, and they end up scattered in different spots, but particularly in Syria and Israel, and Abraham is descended from him. And we have the Joktaanites, which are a bit debated, but there is Jewish sources like Josephus that link them to India and Afghanistan as part of their early settlements. Lud is the Ludim, and they're the Lydians who occupy modern-day Turkey in the early stages. And Aram, there's no argument on them. They concentrate around the area of Syria. So what we're saying here is Shem's descendants are all in that Western Asian area, and the geography of that area is where they made their home in the early centuries. Then we come to Ham. We're told in the Bible that Africa, a lot of Africa is the land of Ham. Cush, as I said before, the Cushites are Ethiopia. Mizraim is the Mizri, is the actual word even used today to describe Egyptians. So a lot of Jewish people, when they talk about Egyptians, use that Mizri from Mizraim as their description. So they settled in Egypt, along with some of the grandsons. The Caphtorim come from them, and some of them, the Philistines, which come out of Mizraim, ended up in the land of Israel. Put is northern Africa, where we get the Libyans and the Cyrene people connected to that area. And the Canaanites, well known in our Bibles, they pop up with all their different names. There's about 7 or 8 of them there: Jebusites, Sidonians, Hivites, Hittites. They're all listed as occupying the land of Israel in the time of Moses. And finally, what is particularly of interest to us, possibly, is Japheth, whose descendants occupy West Asia, but also share some of the land with Shem, but they dominate the colonization of Europe. So Gomer is the Shemarians. They're the ones that create the Gauls and the Germans. So if you've got German blood, you've got a bit of Gomer in you. Then there's Magog. He's the father, according to Josephus, of the Scythians. They're in West Asia, but they do migrate fairly widely, and they become the Irish, the Scots, and the Anglo-Saxons, which a number of us here tonight would connect with. So you've got a bit of Magog in you if you're in one of those groups. Madai is the Medes, well documented in historical sources as connected to the Persians. So the Medes and the Persians were close cousins. Javan is well known as the father of the Ionian Greeks, and he's revered in Greek legend, and his name pops up in different forms in their stories. Tubal is the father of the Tabali, and also what's called the Iberians, and Armenia and Georgia were part of his people group in the early centuries, but there has been migration from that by some of them. Controversial one, Meshech. Some say the Mushki is related to Russia and how Moscow gets its name from the Mushki. Bit of debate on that one, but it does make a bit of sense that they're out of the steppes of Russia in those early periods, which would say that there's probably a bit of commonality with the Russians and the Ukrainians. There is a bit of debate on the early Ukrainians where they might have been from Gomer, possible, but Russians and Ukrainians share a lot of shared history for the last 1,000 years. Tyrrus, the Thracians, they're seen as the father of Troy, the Trojans, the Etruscans, and the Romans. So if you've done your tour around Rome with a tour guide, they often say the mystery of the Etruscans. Where did they come from? Where did they get their intelligence? They're very creative people. Where did they come from? And, basically mystery. But when you look at the understanding of their word name and Tyrrus, you can see, and there is scholars supporting that they're actually the children of Tyrrus, and they link up together to take on the Greeks in the famous story of the sack of Troy city. So a bit of overview there showing the world's geography has a biblical foundation and the peoples of the world have a biblical starting point. They're not coming out of jungles as monkeys getting smarter. And the other story in Genesis is about the building of the Tower of Babel with Nimrod, grandson, Ham, causing a rebellion. And down the track, Nebuchadnezzar wanted to build his own Tower of Babel, and he picked a site, which I believe is correct for the site of the original area on a hill nearby this, and he built this huge structure, which disaster hit at some point in time. I think a lightning bolt hit it, caused a fire, causing the upper third to be burned, according to a Jewish scholar. The lower third sunk into the earth and the middle third remained. And that's what's there today. And the archaeologists have got a lot of information on that site now. And the other thing with Nimrod, he actually founds 4 big cities in the south and 4 big cities in the north of Iraq. And the problem with these cities is they were into idolatry and undermining the purposes of God, and that influence went into the other nations. So a lot of the idolatry came out of that empire that Nimrod started after the flood period. We're now looking at Abraham, a key figure in the forming of the nation of Israel. We know he comes from Ur of the Chaldees. He arrives up in modern-day Syria and camps at the city of Nahor. And his father dies, and then he gets the word to go into the promised land by God. And the route that he takes is very easy to identify, in that his first campsite's at a place called Shechem, which I've visited a number of times now, and a place called Tel Balata has remains of ancient Shechem. And nearby to that site, Abraham camps, and he gets a revelation of God. I believe it's actually Christ manifesting to him, speaks to him and gives him a covenant that his descendants will inherit this land geographically. After that experience, we're told he travels on and camps between a place called Bethel and Ai. I have proposals for them. It's a hill between those 2 archaeological sites. Another covenant is made and another altar is placed in that locality. He then moves on to Hebron. Again, no argument on Hebron in its location. We get lots of information about it. There's an archaeological site, Tel Remuda, in the middle of Hebron. Abraham camps on the outskirts of it, and another covenant occurs, and it's also where he gets promised to have his son Isaac. And then he moves on to another site, very famous to Australians, Beersheba, and more covenants are made. So we see all the sites connected with Abraham have good support with geography, archaeology, and topography. They've all got logic to them. And you know the story that Jacob takes the family down into Egypt via support from Joseph. And I believe initially they start, Joseph's more around the Cairo area with the Pharaoh in the 12th dynasty, but later on in the 13th dynasty, a very oppressive Egyptian regime operates in the Delta area, and they required the Hebrews to build 2 fortifications in what I believe is the Wadi Chumalat. Now, if you can see my word up the top there, Ramesses and Pithom, I have proposals for those 2 sites as being built by the Hebrews for Pharaoh, and that his palace in the 13th dynasty at the time of this Exodus event, his palace is over in Bubastis on the edge of a Nile branch. And the interaction between that Pharaoh and Moses is very close by. There's a lot of communication going on. Pharaoh's hardening his heart. Moses keeps rocking up. He would have gone there by chariot, not walking. And the whole scenario can be explained. And the land of Goshen, which is on the eastern side of that branch of the Nile, is where they're protected by God when all the judgments are occurring on Egypt on the western side. And today, if you go down to this area, there's a number of sites there. 2 of them I've identified. Tel of the Jews is one of the sites near Bilbis, and the other was Tel, spelling error there, Tel Yehudia is another site with evidence that the Jews had it as a meeting place, and they built a temple there at a later time called the Temple of Onias. So from the Wadi Chumalat, the scenario is they have to exit the land in a day. So a large group of people, maybe 900,000, we don't know exactly, but somewhere around that number, have to be able to get out of the land and arrive at Sukkoth on the edge of the land, and then head down to the Red Sea for the dramatic story of the Red Sea crossing and the miracle of being delivered from Pharaoh, who came later with his chariots to try and obliterate them, but God's plan was the other way around. So Kadesh Barnea is there as an important site. Now, if you go to Wikipedia and look up Mount Sinai, where they're headed, you get 11 proposals there that scholars, serious scholars, have put forward where it is. So which one is correct? And the clue to the right Mount Sinai is it has to meet 2 biblical requirements. The first is it's 11, according to Moses, 11 days journey, that's about 330 kilometers from Horeb, which is Mount Sinai, by the way of Mount Seir, which is today's Har Ramon, to Kadesh Barnea. So there has to be a distance from the correct Mount Sinai to this Kadesh Barnea in the Negev. And the only 2 in that whole map that meet that is the one over called Jabal Lawz and Jabal Makla in Midian, or the traditional site near Mount Catherine. They're the only 2 that have that 330 travel distance with them. And the other requirement, it says Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. So Midian is where the correct Mount Sinai is. And God says, on this mountain, after the burning bush experience, on this mountain, you will lead my people here and worship me. So the criteria is it has to be Midian, and all the Bible maps say Midian is northwest Saudi Arabia. So I give support to Jabal Makla as where Moses has the intimate experience of receiving the law, and Jabal Laws nearby is where the first point of descent is. So here it is diagrammatically. We see the route out of Egypt from Ramesses down to the Red Sea, miracle deliverance. They then travel on a trade route, not the route that cars take today, but a trade route, and that's via Mara, where a covenant is made, and down to Elim, which is near Eilat today, and arriving at the correct Mount Sinai in Midian. After their year there, they build the tabernacle, they get the leading of the Holy Spirit through the pillar of fire and the cloud. They head north to Kadesh Barnea, and then because of rebellion, they're forced to circle the Negev twice, and there is sites that can be identified on that story, indicating that's where they're traveling around before they eventually end up over on the eastern side of the Jordan and cross into Jericho. Now, in the conquest of the land, we're given a lot of geographical information, very detailed listing of tribal areas, cities that were conquered, cities that were built, a lot of info. Josephus goes into the detail of it and says the survey was actually done by very skilled surveyors who did a set outlines through the land and made all their descriptions in reference to a survey. That makes sense. I'm a town planner. That's logical for any planning, that you've got to have reference points and you've got to work to a certain logic to establish roadways, buildings, all of that. And that's what Joshua did. And the other interesting thing he says is when they parceled up the land, the criteria was they all had to have enough goodness to be equal in fertile land. So the reason some tribes ended up with smaller parcels, like Zebulon, Issachar, Benjamin, they ended up with fertile areas that didn't need huge amount of space. But the bigger areas, like Manasseh and Judah, didn't have as much fertility. They had a lot of rocky terrain, a lot of woodland. So there was a logic of wanting equality amongst the tribes in that early survey. And the other interesting thing is they prayed to God to guide them in doing the lottery as to who got what bit of territory. So they believed in the sovereignty of God, and you sink or swim on what came out of the breast of Joshua when the land was parceled out. The only controversy geographically that still comes through to today is there's no argument that the River of Egypt is actually a wadi down south of the Negev. That's the southern border. There's no argument the Jordan Valley from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea is an eastern boundary. There's no argument the western boundary, which is the Mediterranean. The big debate is where is the northern boundary? And if you look up the definition of the northern boundary, it's all over the place. There's many sites in Lebanon offered. And why is that controversial? Well, when Israel was fighting back a while back in Lebanon, the big debate was where would they draw a line and say this is our territory and Hezbollah going to have what's to the north. And the Litani River was used, but that I don't believe is correct as the northern boundary. I support a position that it's the Awali River, which is just above Sidon, well-known Phoenician site today in Lebanon. And Sidon was actually given to the tribe of Asher. So I believe the border is correctly identified just above Sidon. Now, an example of debate and where the Bible gets criticised unjustifiably, and that is when you look at the maps for the tribe of Zebulon, you get a few key locators, and they have it as a landlocked tribe with that red dashed line indicating it right in the middle there of the Galilee. Then there's prophetic references to Zebulon being a haven for ships. So they come along and say, well, they got that wrong. Either Joshua got it wrong, they didn't carve it up right to give them a bit of the Mediterranean, or is there another explanation? And the explanation is it's actually the ports on the western side of the Sea of Galilee is the haven for the ships. So you can actually redraw correctly with the right references, the correct boundaries of Zebulun. And the archaeology, the topographics, the haven of ships, there's remains of at least 4 or 5 ancient ports down near, one of them is near Tiberias, on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. So what I'm saying is, like all research, you've got to do your homework, you've got to get the right assumptions. But if something's being criticised, sometimes there's an error in the starting point in how it's been put together. So here's my proposal showing that the Hebrew words for some of these sites give an explanation for where the survey's done, because Joshua's surveyors had to describe it in such a way that sheep herders and people traveling the land could understand, are they in Naphtali, or are they in Zebulon, or are they in Asher? Because territory's territory, you've got to stick to some degree within your own boundaries for peace. So it was important for those early tribes to understand what all the markers were. Now we conclude with some comments about Jesus coming into the land. And Jesus made a very profound statement on the road to Emmaus. He says, beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures, the things concerning himself. So what we're saying is Genesis, Exodus, and all the stuff that Moses is writing about and the prophets have to be seen in the lens of who Christ is and what he's doing from the beginning to the end. Before he's incarnated, he's doing a work, and then he's incarnated and comes into the land and does certain things in certain places. Now, when it comes to the sites where he does things, there is debate. For example, the incarnation, you go to Nazareth, you'll get 2 sites. His birth, believe it or not, no argument. Everyone agrees on that. X marks the spot. We'll see it in a minute. His baptism, we get 3 or 4 locations. The Last Supper, at least 2. The crucifixion, I'm writing a book on that at the moment. The crucifixion and the resurrection at the moment has 8 candidates for consideration, and his ascension on the Mount of Olives has 3. So what happens when pilgrims come to the land is which one's correct? Is there an argument supporting one against the other? And I believe there is on many of these things. For example, I believe the Catholic site in Nazareth, this huge basilica built there, is based on good historical grounds, good topographic, and a whole lot of other factors, I believe is the correct one. The other one is orthodox, but this one, I believe, is the location where the angel Gabriel comes and, you know the story, the incarnation occurs. This is the one where there's no argument, the Church of the Nativity, a very old church. in Bethlehem, very popular with pilgrims, nearly got destroyed by the Persians in the 6th century. It got saved by the fact they had mosaics of the wise men from the east, and the Persians coming to burn the church recognized the Persian dress and said, hey, they're one of us, and saved the church. So there you go. A bit of artwork can be useful in a church. And the next one is X marks the spot. There is a niche in the crypt of that church where it's believed that Jesus was born in an animal grotto. It's not in the town of Nazareth. They got no lodgings there. So Joseph had to arrange, because he was a local of that area, he knew about this cave on the hill opposite, which is where this site is. With the baptism, a number of sites, but if you go today, busload after busload arrive both from the Jordanian side and the Israeli side, and the pilgrims connect at the River Jordan and are very close to one another. You can talk to one another across the river. My proposal is that Jesus was baptized in a location similar to where the ark was carried. You know, the story where the ark is carried by the priests and it's held in the River Jordan to stop the water, to enable the Hebrew people to cross into the promised land. There's 2,000 cubits between that point and the crossing point. So my logic is you get a good crossing point for the people, go 2,000 cubits to the north, you get somewhere around this area where I have the word Jesus baptism and the ark crossing. And what's interesting is the Byzantine era had a number of churches in that locality, showing for them they believed there was a spiritual significance to it. But the site where all the buses arrive today is the one a little bit more to the south, and that is where it's celebrated and many people get baptized there. So a bit of history for this locality. When we come to Jerusalem, there is debate about a couple of things. One is, where is the city of David and Mount Zion? Now, up until the 19th century, everyone agreed the city of David was on a high point on a hill to the west, which on the map is called Mount Zion. That was a strong tradition that the church had for many years. But when archaeologists came and queried it and said, nah, we don't agree with that. We think it's actually on the hill to the east. So if you look at a lot of maps today, they actually have the city of David labelled on that lower hill. I believe they're wrong in their assumption there. I believe the lower city is the city of Jerusalem, and that David had his citadel and small encampment on the high point on traditional Mount Zion, and later on Jesus does certain activity on that hill involving the Last Supper and also later on the event of Pentecost. And I do support the traditional location of Golgotha, indicated there with the cross outside the city walls. I believe that is correct. And Temple Mount, I believe, is correct for the original Temple of Solomon being built. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and I support it as the correct location for Calvary, but I don't believe it's correct for the resurrection. That's a controversial thing to say, but you'll have to wait for my next book I'm working on, where I go into all the arguments why I take that position. This topic has a lot of passion with it, but most of the mainline churches do support this for Calvary, and it's that little square building sitting on the top in the foreground, as the Calvary Chapel is in there, And under the big blue dome at the back is the traditional site for the resurrection. So that's what pilgrims like to visit, and a lot of history with the site, a lot of tumults over the years with different invasions, but the faithfulness of the Christians to preserve that locality is commendable. And on the Mount of Olives, we have several positions for the ascension. I believe it's on the summit. That's the logical point. And the highest point, according to my visit there and checking, is somewhere around where the Russians have built this huge bell tower that was built so pilgrims could get a view of the Jordan River. But it's very close to the summit, and in the foreground there is a library. So somewhere around this area here is where Jesus ascended, and to the amazement of the disciples. And then the two men in white that appeared at that event said, this is where he's coming back again. So again, a geographical marker, no argument that he's coming back again to a particular spot from a biblical viewpoint. And then to finish off, we have an interesting statement in that there was a famous British archaeologist, Sir William Ramsay, 19th century guy, who really attacked Luke in his writing of the book of Acts and said it was full of geographical and archaeological errors. And as a result, he went on a detailed tour of Israel and Turkey, to prove these errors. But after many years of research, he came to a profound conclusion that actually led to his conversion, Christian conversion. And he wrote a statement, further study showed that the book of Acts could bear the most minute scrutiny as an authority for the facts of the Aegean world, and that it was written with such judgment, skill, art, and perception of truth as to be a model of historical statement. So he recognized that Luke took seriously, as he says in one of his intros, he wanted to get all the facts before he wrote down these accounts. So all the details about the churches in Asia, Paul's missionary journeys, all those things that are in the New Testament, he said they all stack up from his viewpoint as reliable. And we conclude with the grand statement at the end of the book of Revelation that even though the world's groaning and travailing with many issues and problems, those problems have been around for a long time. Some say they're getting worse, but nonetheless, they're real. And we're told that at the end, the plan of God is that the current heavenly city, which operates above the universe as we know it, is going to leave that dimension and is going to come down and reunite with a renovated earth. So the magnificent promise is the summation of everything ultimately, geographically, is to a renovated earth and a new resurrected life, which is promised through what Christ has done. And it's all real, and it's there as a promise to us to experience and to share with others. And the last slide, just for those who are a bit more analytical, how big is the current city? There it is, sitting on top of the globe in reference. And if you plot out its area, it's about 2/3 of the area of Australia on its ground level. Some say it's got 3 levels, explaining the pyramidal shape. So that's a bit of geometry and a concluding geographical comment. So thank you for the opportunity of sharing on this topic, which is one of my passions. And I haven't been able to see any questions, Kevin, so I'll rely on you to feed me if there's any.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Good. So feel free to unmute your microphones if you'd like to participate. Now, I made the initial comment on slide 5. I'll just see if I can find it. I'll just start sharing again. I will bring the slide. Oh, gone too far. Wrong way. Sorry. Yes, it shows Australia there.
I was worried about Australia in slide 9.
Yes, but it says 1570. Did they actually know about Australia at that time?
No. What you're looking at is Snyder. He's writing in 1858, so he's plonking what was known. Australia was known then. He's plonking it as a part of Africa in his global map. So
right, okay, yeah, there's 1858 on that slide.
Yeah. But in 1750, Ortelius, he worked with a guy called Mercator, which is well known to us today because of Mercator's projection. They were buddies, and they were developing in Holland globes, trying to explain the shape of continents, because before then, a lot of maps, if you look at Roman and Greek maps, they're very linear. They're like mud maps where you can work out stuff, but it's got no spherical geometry to it. So they were into trying to plot the Earth on a global map. So the first atlas is made by this guy, 1570. So there would have been Terra Australia, was it Incognito or something? There was the Great Southland idea that somewhere down there had to be some land to balance the world. But on the map you're referring to, it's
1858, not 1580.
Different.
I can't remember what year William Dampier visited.
1680, is it 1688?
16 something.
1688, I think.
Yeah, but he wouldn't have a clue about the map of Australia because he
just mapped the coastline at Western Australia.
Yeah.
His mountain, all that area.
Are you I'll just put gallery on, by the way. And I'll stop sharing. Right. Okay. You mentioned a physical depiction of hell as though it is kind of some physical place. But in the Bible, you kind of get the imagery that hell is below and heaven above. But even I wouldn't kind of take that literally. It's just figurative to kind of help our understanding. So are you saying that hell has an actual physical location?
Well, that's the big debate. I believe it's a real dimension. And in my journey as a Christian, I've come across all sorts of stories and people who claim they have visited hell, just like there's people who have claimed they have visited heaven. For example, just to illustrate, there's a missionary who rescued orphan children in Tibet, China area 100 years ago. And the children came into spiritual revival, and they described to this missionary guy, in their experience, they were translated to the heavenly realm and saw beautiful things and angels up in heaven, and that it was real smells, real sounds, a real dimension. Then they said some of them were actually taken down and saw hell as a terrible place and real. So what we have to see is Jesus taught, for example, when the story of Lazarus, the beggar, and the rich man, that story, Jesus is indicating that they're real people with a real understanding of the spiritual realm. Where our problem is the spiritual realm is governed by different laws of physics than the natural realm. So, for example, the biblical understanding is angels are moving around our planet all the time, but they're not being picked up by global mapping systems or radar, but they are moving around our atmosphere. So it's not a problem to have hell as an underworld, and that certainly the Jewish understanding of Sheol is that it's a real place where the spirits of the dead go, and they await their release from that dimension and, you know, the promise of life after death. So what I'm saying, Kevin, is I believe it's a real dimension that operates in an underworld domain, but we can't plot it with our natural technology, but it is real.
You're talking about those orphans in China, Tibet area. The book is called Visions Beyond the Veil, if anyone wants to look for that.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, it's a very interesting book, but there's many accounts of people having visions and seeing angels. When I was doing street ministry in Melbourne Street in the heady 70s, we had people that claimed that they could see angels hovering over our coffee shop that we were doing ministry in, and I couldn't see them. And they said, look, I can see it. There's one up there, and described it. Well, all right, well, he's either on drugs or telling the truth, but people do have lots of stories of that. And do you remember the book by Mel Tari on the revival in
Indonesia,
up in Timor? When they went out doing missionary work, they had lots of experiences of angels walking in their midst.
All right, we'll move on to Brian's comment. How reasonable is it to look for Eden in today's world if we believe the old world was dramatically destroyed during and shortly after a global flood? Did you want to make any more comment on that, Brian?
I think that speaks for itself.
My comment, Brian, is, you know, the debate is, did the tree of life that's clearly in the Garden of Eden, did that get destroyed with Noah's flood? I believe it wasn't destroyed. I believe that dimension, not huge in size, but that dimension was actually removed, and it still exists in a spiritual way, hovering at some point above the earth. And therefore, it awaits the final order where eventually it finds a place in the new heaven and the new earth. So I don't believe that tree is destroyed by the flood. That's my position on that one. And when you look at the scriptures, it's implied that the tree of life is there in the book of Revelation.
Yeah, the tree, yes, but what about looking for a site for Eden in today's world? When today's world, it would be totally different. You showed the Pangaea or Gondwana land, all that sort of thing being spread apart. So the world is obviously a very different place now to what it would have been then. So how reasonable is it to look for a location for Eden, just because we've got a couple of rivers with the same name that we used then?
Well, my point there is it's very important to see the rivers are radically different to the river today. So the Euphrates today is not the Euphrates of Genesis.
Yep.
Same with the Tigris. They are different, but the names carry on. And that the other thing that's important to note is the topography of the pre-flood world, as I mentioned about the flood dimensions. The mountain ranges are lower implied, and that after the flood, you get the high upthrust of the Himalayas and Andes as post-flood event. So the world before Noah has long age. People live 700-800 years. It has to be a much different environment and has to have different properties in the vegetation and in the food they eat, the bodies they enjoyed. The whole physics of the atmosphere supported long life. After the flood, it radically changes. So we've got to see it's different. The point of why it's given to us, not in a lot of detail, is to show the original plan of God was perfect, but because of sin, it got lost. But that doesn't mean God abandoned it. His plan is he works a process whereby it's restored in a greater way in the final order of things, both geographically and enjoyment of life wise.
So given all that, why should we think we can work out where Eden is or was on today's world, given that all that has changed?
Well, my point there, what I was trying to make in my slide, is God has spiritually mapped the earth for certain things to happen in certain places. So when I did that diagram of Noah's altar and Jerusalem and a proposal there in Iraq for the garden, what I'm saying is they're all based on a certain plan that has meaning. There's connections between Christ, if you accept that it's Christ talking to Adam and Christ sacrificing the lamb in the garden to make the skin to put on Adam's body. If you accept that, you've got to see that Christ is wanting that location and event to point to later on in Jerusalem. He's going to become the sacrificial lamb, and he's going to make the provision to cover us from the effects of sin. So that's the powerfulness with what I call the prophetic, that it's not accidental where they're occurring. It's all happening to a certain logic from God's viewpoint.
But if we 100% accept what you've just been saying, I still do not see how that answers my question.
Well, what answer do you want in that? Does it matter, yes or no? Well, some would say it doesn't matter. All I'm saying is it's in God's word for a purpose, for us to show an interest in examining, and it's no different to us researching the origins of where certain things occurred in our history. Now, is it important to know for Australians where the Battle of Beersheba occurred? Well, pilgrims there, and they all want to know, where was the hill where they charged down? Where did they do it? That's part of how humans are. We want to know where events occur. That's why I'm saying it's of interest.
I wouldn't mind adding on to this, because I think it's along the my question or a reference that I point out next is along these lines, because I say that you reference the Ice Age, which Noah and his descendants would have experienced. Before that, the land would have been very different. And where the three rivers merged into the Garden of Eden is now considered to be 200 feet below sea level in the southeastern part of what is the Persian Gulf. Now, that quote comes from Hugh Ross's 2021 blog on finding migration routes for early humans, where he may, and it doesn't contradict what you're saying in a sense, but saying it's further below the sea, because the land has changed.
Yes, that's right. He does have it buried. I'm saying it's not buried. There's nothing in Genesis that says it was. All it said, and this is the important point, two things happened. Adam and Eve were expelled from it. They couldn't continue as sinners in it. And the second thing that's very important to understand is protective cherubim were placed around it to guard it so that people would not get to that tree unauthorized. That's why I believe it exists in a dimension outside of our ability to take advantage.
It could be in heaven, even. It could be in heaven. I like the bit in Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark, where the ark sort of ascends, and you think, well, that's probably where it actually went, which is to heaven,
You're right. There's always what I'm saying. When you do research, you come across different proposals. I was aware of Hugh Ross's one for the garden. The United Nations, when they go into it, they put a lot of import on the existing geographical labels, the Tigris, Euphrates junction. That's why what I'm saying is I'm taking what I call a prophetic approach, that I believe God has a logic in a particular area that shows it's not an accidental event that's happening.
What I find interesting, when you mentioned how the land was divided up by into the tribes, but according to them having enough, like all equal amounts, considering a very rich amount. Now, Jerusalem, or Israel, I suppose, apparently has a very deep, or what would you say, deep oil reserves, okay, and gas reserves apparently, and that's interesting because they don't have much land, like, you know, it's only tiny, you know, if you compare it to Australia.
It's not the Mediterranean, Bron. It's in the Mediterranean. It's where the big gas reserves are.
Yeah, well,
on the land, it's in the Med.
In the Mediterranean, yeah. And Russia, with all its problems, might actually want to have a bit of the finger in the pie. So that might be an issue that raises its head in the next few years. But yeah, I just thought that was an interesting observation that you were saying about the being divided up and having,
may I just get back to Trevor? I don't know if you've walked in through the Dung Gate to the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall, but as you walk along, there's the ramp that leads up to the the Temple Mount above, the Islam, and there is a plaque there which says the Jewish tradition identifies Jerusalem as a place where Adam was when he was created. So their view, and it might only be tradition, is that the Garden of Eden was in near the Temple Mount.
Yes, that's right. There's plenty of candidates offered for that. The Jews make a big thing. They call the Sacra rock in the rock the foundation of the world.
That's right.
They use that idea that everything's created out from that. So the point with what Bronwyn's raising is with the land. If you're an agricultural people, it's important to have pasture for flocks and seed bearing. So it's not the size of your tribe, it's where you can grow your wheat, feed your cows and support your family. And what was interesting is Josephus said they saw it as important that every tribe got access to a bit of water and some good land to keep their tribe functional, and that's a good policy to have if you're building a nation. And it was there in their things, but over time, of course, they started fighting and squabbling and divided the kingdom, and they had invasions, and the story there.
I like the reference to we talk about divisions of land, where Caleb's daughter actually says, give me my share, and he says, yes, okay, I will, because she actually asked for it. That was the only reason why he gave it to it. So women's
asked for water with it.
Yeah, some water. Yeah, that's right. She asked for a fair share, but yeah.
Those sites are down in below Hebron.
Yeah.
We'll move on to Steve's comment. More primitive civilizations today probably occurred after the Tower of Babel split people by their technical knowledge as well as their language. Did you want to talk to that, Steve?
Oh, only briefly. And again, it was actually one of the creation magazines that pointed out in a more modern era, there was some primitive people in the jungle in Thailand adjacent to cleared crop growing people. And the general, world in knowledge was, the primitive people were much older people, and some of them eventually worked out how to do farming, and they all worked out. So the primitive people in the jungle, more advanced people are out. And then they looked at a story from the farming people and said, once upon a time, we had to sacrifice 2 young people, and we sent them into the jungle. And when they did the DNA tests, the micro, whatever it is called, they worked out they actually are linked, so that this myth, whatever it was, showed that more primitive people are not necessarily the first inhabitants. You could actually have a situation like that, as in the Tower of Babel, where as the people groups, each with their own language, some of the technical knowledge went with some groups, and some of the primitive, or some of the lack of that knowledge, then with other groups. And that's why today we see people that are, I've got to be careful using the word primitive, our own indigenous people are very good with boomerangs and stuff like that, and can hunt a kangaroo much better than I ever could. But this share of the technical knowledge was split up at the time after Babel.
Mm. Yeah, that's right. As tribes move around, they can lose information very quickly within one generation.
Yep.
So you start off with good skills and within one generation start losing it. Yeah.
Steve, your next comment, Mount Catherine was only identified as Sinai in 400 AD. In Galatians, St. Paul says Sinai was in Arabia.
Yeah. This is only really confirming what Trevor's already told us, that the evidence certainly is that, Mount Sinai, the one that Moses led them to, was not at the point of Mount Catherine, which is now on the traditional site of Mount, but rather where he pointed out in the land of Midian across the Gulf of Aqaba.
Does Midian correspond to Arabia? Would
Yes, it does. Midian,
Northern Arabia.
The same Arabia that we refer to?
Midian was on, in fact, if we read the Midianites, you go back to the sons of Abraham, the Midianites did move down to what would be on the Gulf of Aqaba. So they were in that part, and indeed later on when Gideon has to defeat them, you read that the Midianites and the Arabs are more or less mixed up. So they certainly seem to have this common area of place. They were, if you like, east of the Jordan. And certainly we read the Midianites were on the east side of the Gulf of Aqaba.
The map that Trevor had showed it quite clearly.
Yes.
So they're kind of the north section of Arabia there.
Yeah.
All right. Now, Steve, you had the last say as well.
Sorry about this. Okay. Yes.
I'll read it out for the sake of the readers, and less in case people on YouTube can't get it. Trouble with the Christian witness at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is that the Catholics and Orthodox priests fight each other for a priority, and Israeli police have to intervene. There is a ladder standing on a wall that cannot be moved because of the disagreement as who has the authority to do so.
Yeah. And that's, where I
you
find...
insert that for humour or...
Oh, no, it's a tragedy. Yes, I agree totally with Trevor's assertion. That probably is the place. Trouble is, and in fact, it goes right to the last slide that Trevor showed. Our real place of hope is not here on this earth. It's not in the walls of Jerusalem. It's what's going to come from above. And the fact that we fight over the, menial things like who's got priority to be in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is really sad, and it's a very poor witness to the Israeli public who see us squabbling with each other.
But just to me, that just screams of legalism.
Oh,
to me.
yes.
And apparently Derek Prince reckons legalism is the hardest thing in our humanity to kill, because it keeps rearing its ugly head up.
Yes.
And in our own lives, we'll see it as well.
Yes.
Yes.
Now, I've been to the other site that sometimes proposed, but that was Gordon of Khartoum about 1880, who identified the Garden Tomb as a probable site or a possible site. And even though it's a beautiful service to go to, there's no doubt about it that it was a very, very late guess on the behalf of Gordon of Khartoum to choose that site as an alternative. So as much as I've enjoyed going to the Garden Tomb on the Easter Sunday morning, it's not the real site.
Hmm.
Right, that's the end of the comments, or the formal comments, so it's open up for any general discussion.
I'm not going to bring up, well, I don't want to be controversial, but I just want to understand where you're coming from, Trevor. When you mentioned, this is probably slightly off topic, but you mentioned it in the beginning, when you talked about the plants dying, or in reference to God for creating the earth and calling it good. So you're saying the plants were dying before God was saying it was good, or after he's saying it's good, or...
what I'm saying is the original creation was good, and to be called good, it can't have disease or death.
But that includes plants, you're saying?
all of life, the plants, the animals.
So what would that plant? What would the only thing I have the problem with that is I can't understand what animals would have eaten if they can't eat plants.
No, but plants are just plants. They're not life as we what I'm saying is, in the order of creation, different levels of life, if you want to call it. So there is a beauty and there is a functionality with plants, animals, and humans. And we as humans, although we're animal, we are more than animal in that we're also spiritual in the image of God. So there is an order in the way God creates things. Originally, there was a perfection and a harmony, but as a result of sin and its effect. So it's a little bit like a bit of poison came into Adam and Eve. They didn't die on the spot, but a part of them started to die. And that's why we're told Adam lives for, 900 and so many years. A long
950.
a long time. But the seed of the start of dying was in the garden by eating the fruit. So it enters into his body. He starts to die, but he is such a fantastic creation initially. He's actually a carbon copy of Christ. If you can see, the word for image is the same word Israelis use for photocopy. He's an exact facsimile in that eyeball to eyeball speech. The whole encounter in the garden was very intimate because Adam is in the image of Christ and he's like a carbon copy. And when sin occurred, you've got this guilt, shames, alienation. But in the final order, in the new heaven and the new earth, we see Christ in all his glory, and he sees us with a new glory. We're resurrected with a new glory that there's no shame anymore between us in terms of the final thing. It's an incredible promise. That's Jesus.
Paul references to Christ being the second Adam.
Right. Yeah, it's very, very powerful.
Yeah, just a correction to what I said. He actually lived 930 years. Only 930, not 950.
But the point, Jeff, I would say, is he's actually a very, very smart cookie. He's naming animals. He's taking in everything God's done. So I believe he's a scientist, he's a geographer, he's a gardener, he's a zoologist. He's got many attributes. So in that early family, there's intelligence. And over time, we're told the world became violent. So as each generation comes, they start losing the plot. But initially, it was all good.
Do you reckon he was an engineer as well?
Why not?
It would have been a river to float down. He would have had to design a boat, wouldn't he?
Well, that's just about the pinnacle of things, isn't it? Being an engineer. Oh no.
That's
read about
a bit of self-praise, Jeff. But I agree with you.
We read about the next generation where it says that Cain went and built a city. So there's engineering in the family.
A pressing issue is the reliability of the Gospels, and have the Gospel writers got their geography correct? For example, the location of the healing of the demoniac, you get the impression it's on the coast of the Sea of Galilee, but it also mentions Gerasa and the Gadarenes, which are miles away. So I think issues like that kind of disturb people more than some of the others.
Yeah, I've been to those areas, and it's fairly clear to me that there's two different stories involving demoniacs, and that area was known for certain occult activity and was considered a dark area by the Jews, dark as in spiritually. And the other thing to keep in mind with those gospel references, there is a city called Gadara that's the capital of a region. So he's called a Gadarene because he's in the region. He's not in the city of Gadara. He's in the Gadarene region, which is on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. And the other reference I've forgotten, but there's another indication that two stories get your geography right. I have got notes on it if you want to talk about it later at some point. What I'm saying is there's always a reason in the Gospels for certain descriptions of certain sites, and they did do their homework when they wrote their Gospels. They're not telling porkies. And
there's also the implication in the story there that where that occurred was some distance from the city, settlement, town, or whatever it was where the people were.
Yeah. Yeah, I've actually been to the
go a long way
tradition.
to get into the sea.
What was that, Kevin?
Wouldn't the pigs have to run a long way to run down?
The pigs and the pig herders and the demoniac, that sort of thing, could have been near the sea, but the settlement where the people were was some distance from that point.
Yeah, there is a very steep hill on the east side of the lake near a place called Iron Gev. I've stomped all over that area. And one of the beliefs is, this is a bit controversial, but one of the beliefs is that the pigs actually come hurtling down this very steep hill, but they don't actually go into the harbour port Galilee. They're actually in a swamp area adjacent to it, and they actually get buried in a swamp near that's part of the Sea of Galilee, but not in the thing, because if you've got a large herd of pigs going into a Jewish sea, it literally makes the whole sea potentially unclean, and therefore you can't eat any fish from it or whatever the story is. But there is some sites that do support what Kevin's asking as a spot in question.
Yeah, I've actually been to what's one of the traditional sites, or the most commonly regarded traditional site. I think it's called Kursi, Kursi now.
Yeah.
Kevin was with me, actually. Kevin and I and a few others went there. But unfortunately, it was closed just when we got there. We were a little late to get into it, so we didn't see what was to be inside. But I do believe that there are ancient tombs there and that there are some caves as well right near that site. I would have liked to have seen them, but didn't get to see it.
I've got photos of it if you want them, and there's mosaics in there. The Byzantines made a big thing of it with the pilgrim routes in that.
Oh, yeah.
Can I just go back to one point that is the controversy about the shifting plates, and that is when Wegner and the other guys I mentioned talked about continental drift. What the modern research was saying is it's leaning more to there at some point in the Earth's history, the crust of the Earth was fractured in a major way. And I looked up today, there is an argument that 3.26 million years ago, an asteroid hit planet Earth and shattered it, causing all the cracks for the continental plates. That's a long time ago. And the evidence of the asteroid is gone, and the evidence where it hits gone. So my question, being a bit cheeky, is there the possibility that where Satan dropped on the earth after rebelling from heaven, did he, in his fall, cause the fracturing action in the atmosphere of the good earth? That's a comment. And the other comment is with the plates, a lot of the mountain ridges are at the intersection, like over in New Zealand, why they have such big earthquakes there is they're right on the ring of fire. And those mountains are the result of plate tectonics in the past. That
also, each of the major oceans, Atlantic, Indian and Pacific, have a big volcanic, or a big rift in the middle of the oceans where there's volcanic islands that pop up. In Indian Ocean, we've got Heard Island, which is part of Australia, which has, I think, Mawson Peak, and of course through parts and goes up through the Indian Ocean in different parts. You've got the Atlantic, you've got a few volcanoes down the middle there. I think the Azores and other places have it. And of course, in the Pacific Ocean, you've got Hawaii, Tahiti has some volcanoes, and other places as well, right down the middle of the ocean. So as though the oceans are spreading apart and forcing themselves apart, so that once, the continents were once joined, but now we've got the evidence of the fracture right down the middle of each of the major oceans.
They don't move very quickly though, do they? 2 to 10 centimetres a year or something?
Yeah, and it is now. Yes, you're right. In fact, it was Dr. Morris, I guess I'm quoting a creation guy, but it was about 1960 he wrote a book that certainly looked into why the tectonics could have resulted in the Earth as we see it now.
All right. Is it a suitable time to stop the recording now, or does anybody want to raise any more points? Okay then. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. Your slides were very graphic, probably a poor use of words, and you put a lot of effort into the preparation of slides, and we thank you for that, and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you, Trevor.
Yeah, and at this time, yeah, I'll stop the recording.